In this section of Crisis of Faith, we'll be looking at Rise and Reform, Protestants and Catholics. The Reformation spread to many parts of mainland Europe, as the Catholic Church viewed this as a heretical threat to Christendom and attempted to stamp it out. So the Reformation was on the rise and spreading to many parts of mainland Europe, but as it crossed the English Channel into England, it did so as a political solution to a troubled king in an unwanted marriage. It is this famous King of England that would soon turn his entire country away from the Catholic Church to form his own state church, the Church of England. And this king is Henry VIII, who takes the throne in 1509. He is the King of England who marries Catherine of Aragon. She is a Spanish princess, but also his brother's Spanish widow. And because he's marrying his brother's widow, this requires an approval by the Pope, which is granted. Now, the two of them for 18 years have no male children. Catherine has a few stillbirths, a few miscarriages, but they only produce one child, a daughter, Mary. Now, this threatens the royal lineage or royal bloodline of Henry. And it's not that women couldn't rule, they could. It was just seen as easier for a woman to be overtaken by a rival family or to be usurped. So they need a male on the throne. And after 18 years of marriage, no male children. But then Henry meets Anne Boleyn and wants to marry her, needing the Pope to nullify his first marriage. Now, Anne Boleyn had been one of Catherine's chambermaids and had fallen in love with her and wants to marry her, but the problem is he's already married. So his solution to this problem is, well, if I can nullify my first marriage and act as if it never happened, that's going to need the Pope's approval, and the Pope refuses. And it's not just the Pope that refuses, Anne also refuses, not wanting to become just another one of the king's mistresses. She rejects his advances, insisting on marriage and the promise of a son. So she wants Henry, but she doesn't want to just be a mistress. She wants to be married to him. She wants to be the queen. And she entices him with a promise that if he marries her, she will produce him a son. But unfortunately for Henry, the Pope refuses this. So he's kind of stuck in a situation where he wants to get out of one marriage so he can get into another marriage. And this is where Henry gets some political solutions to this religious problem. The Catholic Church being uncooperative for Henry, he decides to break away from the Catholic Church. In his mind, the thing that's standing in his way is the Catholic Church. He wants to annul his first marriage. It is the Pope, it is the Catholic Church that's keeping this from happening. So why do I need the Catholic Church? So he starts this breakaway from the Catholic Church. It starts in 1532 when Parliament passes the Act of Submission, in which Parliament puts the English clergy and religious law under royal authority. So all the clergy, all the priests, and all the religious laws of England are now put under his authority, the king's authority. And of course, being in charge of religious law, Henry nullifies his first marriage and goes on to marry Anne Boleyn, who does give birth, as she promised, but it's not a son, it's another daughter, who they name Elizabeth. Now, this still is a problem for Henry because technically his first child, Mary, is the next in line to the throne unless he has a son. In 1534, they fix this with the Act of Succession. Parliament declares Henry's first child, Mary, illegitimate, as if she does not count. She does not belong to Henry. So that any child that he has with Anne will succeed him. So if he does have a son or another daughter, that those will succeed him rather than Mary. And finally, in 1534, with the Act of Supremacy, Parliament declares Henry VIII the head of a new church, an Anglican church, the Church of England, as England officially breaks away from the Catholic Church and establishes a new state church with the king, Henry VIII, as the head of it. But of course, Henry has more than just two wives. And it's these other wives that make him so famous in history, that he has so many wives. And so we're going to take a little bit of time to look into the other wives of Henry VIII because I think they're interesting. One, starting off with Queen Anne, his second wife, she wouldn't produce sons either, and later is executed for treason. Supposedly, according to rumor, she was having an affair. Now, depending on what school of thought you look into, is whether that's very credible. Many people say it's probably not credible that she had an affair. It was just used to get rid of her. But before this, Henry VIII meets a lady named Jane Seymour. She is actually Anne's chambermaid and marries her only a few days after Anne's execution. So his third wife now, Jane Seymour, becomes the favorite of all of his wives because she does something that the rest of them will not do, and that is to produce him a son, a boy, who they name Edward. But unfortunately for him and her, she dies a few months after giving birth due to complications during childbirth. So he goes into a couple of years of a deep, deep depression after Jane Seymour dies. It was his favorite wife, loved her the most. He's actually buried next to her. But after a couple of years, he decides he needs to remarry for political reasons. And in this case, he marries Anne of Cleves. Now, this is an arranged marriage for political reasons, as he wants to strengthen his ties to Germany and the relationship between England and Germany. So he marries a German princess. And as the story goes, he sent one of his royal painters to Germany to paint a portrait of this woman so he would know what she looked like before he married her. And according to the story, the father of this girl knew that his daughter wasn't the prettiest thing, so paid off the painter to paint her in a nicer light, in a better light, so she would look better than she actually did. I guess you can think of this as a Renaissance version of photoshopping her image. And so Henry's very excited to marry her. The first time he meets her is actually on their wedding day, and he discovers that he's really not that attracted to her. He thinks she's very ugly. So their marriage only lasts, I think, a couple of months before he annuls that marriage, as if it never happened. And he goes for Catherine Howard. Now, she's a teenager when he marries her, and he is 49 years old. But their marriage also does not last because she is executed for treason. Unlike Anne, that was rumored to have an affair, it's well documented that Catherine Howard had numerous affairs with a bunch of different men. And that did her in because, again, to cheat on the king is to go against the king and the religious leader. It's a form of treason, is the way they look at it. So she is executed, and that leaves Catherine Parr, the last wife who survives him and goes on to influence Henry to reconcile with his daughters that he had distanced himself from ever since Edward's birth, especially Mary from his first marriage, but influences Henry to allow them to become future heirs to the throne after Edward, which he does. Now, if all these wives get a little confusing, there's a little chart here that lets you know what was the fate of each of his wives, and there is a rhyme that goes with it that goes, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Catherine of Aragon, she was divorced. He divorced her to marry Anne. Anne supposedly had an affair, therefore it was treason. She was beheaded. Then he marries Jane Seymour, who gives him a boy. She dies in childbirth. He marries Anne of Cleves, discovers she's ugly, divorces her, marries Catherine Howard. She has numerous affairs. She is committed treason. She is beheaded. And then Catherine Parr, his last wife, survives him. So those are the 6 wives of Henry VIII. So after Henry's death, his son Edward takes over, King Edward VI. Now he reforms the Church of England, making it much more Protestant than his father, Henry VIII, had done. But of course, he doesn't last very long on the throne either. He dies at a very, very young age. He was a very sickly young child, so he dies very early in his reign. And because he never married and had any children, the next person in line to the throne is Henry's first child, which is Mary. She becomes Queen Mary, better known as Bloody Mary, with a Spanish mother. Remember, he was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, and to be Spanish is to be Catholic. Mary was raised as a good Catholic. So she comes to the throne and changed England back to Catholicism, making it illegal to be Protestant. But she goes a step further than that. In one instance, she has nearly 300 Protestants burned as heretics, earning her her infamous name of Bloody Mary. Now, the growing conflict between Catholics and Protestants weakened the spiritual unity that had existed in Europe, causing insecurity and anxiety among Christians who now felt isolated. Within this anxious spiritual period, many found scapegoats or persons who bear unjustified blame to place blame for the troubled times. And it's in the 15 and 1600s that the biggest scapegoat that you find are witches. This is where you have the infamous witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. This mass hysteria over the belief in witchcraft led to executions of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of supposed witches, mostly women, although there were a few men that were convicted of witchcraft, across Europe, even spreading so far as to make it to America with the infamous Salem witch trials from 1692 to 1693. Now, one of the biggest contributing factors to this hysteria was a book that was published in 1487 called the Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Witch's Hammer or the Hammer of the Witch. This book's detailing of the evils of witchcraft helped spread this witchcraft hysteria across Europe and was used to try and convict witches. And typically most of these witches were, in Europe, burned at the stake. It's a common misconception to believe that in the Americas that we burned witches, but that never happened. There's very, very few accounts of anyone in America ever being burned. There's two that come to mind, but only two people coming to mind in the Americas that were ever burned. But in the 15 and 1600s in Europe, it was pretty common to burn people for heresy, in this case, witchcraft. So this is the big time period where you see a lot of burning of people in Europe. And these witches were convicted on both sides of the religious spectrum. Both Protestants and Catholics went after witches. And speaking of Catholics, they're having a little bit of trouble too in having to reform themselves. Recognizing that the excesses that they had done had led to the rise of Protestantism, the Catholic Church is forced to look at itself and take some steps to correct past mistakes through a series of reforms within the church itself. It could easily be said that one of the best things to happen to the Catholic Church was the Protestant Reformation because it forced it to reform. And the first step that they took was in the Council of Trent, which was a series of meetings from 1545 to 1563, which started to determine the problems with the Catholic Church and to come up with solutions to fix those problems. One of the things that they started to do was establish schools across Europe for the proper education and preparation of priests. So you don't have that problem earlier of illiterate priests, that clerical ignorance that we talked about. Another thing that they do is forbidding the selling of church offices or indulgences. Not that they said that selling indulgences was wrong, they just stopped doing it. And they went even further to demand a high and strict moral code for all their clergy, so you don't have this moral decline happening within the church. And lastly, they started a new group called the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus. These were Catholic followers who used education to spread and restore Catholicism. Now, it's in America that the Jesuits are responsible for coming across the Atlantic and converting the natives and instructing them in the Catholic way. So it is the Jesuits in places like Latin and South America that are responsible for converting those people to Christianity, and in this case, Catholicism. Now in Europe, they will be responsible for helping to restore Catholicism in the places where it's starting to wane and go away. So finally, the Catholic Church reaffirmed its beliefs in things like the seven sacraments, the position of the Pope. Now strengthened, the Catholic Church was prepared to wage war to defend its faith. So the last thing we're going to look at is a religious rival that pops up between Catholics and Protestants when two countries that don't like each other actually go to war in the late 16th century. It's during the mid-16th century that both Protestants and Catholics aggressively tried to win over Europe. This struggle forced both sides to become more militant and cause religious wars throughout Europe, but none more famous than the rivalry that develops between the defenders of Catholic and Protestant faith, Spain and England. And on the Catholic side, you have King Philip II, who rules from 1556 to 1588. He is the Spanish king during their golden age, when they are conquering South America, when they're bringing in tons and tons of gold. They have a huge influence over Europe. They control the Mediterranean. His defense of Catholicism and his defeat of Protestantism becomes one of the major goals of his kingship. And it's actually King Philip II here that reestablished Christian control over the Mediterranean that had long been under Muslim control thanks to the Turkish or Ottoman navy. It's his navy that goes in and crushes the Turks. So he establishes Spain as Europe's most dominant sea power and the biggest defender of the Catholic faith. Now on the other side, you have Elizabeth I, who rules from 1558 to 1603. She is the queen after Mary's death. Mary died in 1558. She never had any children, so Elizabeth becomes the Queen of England, changing the Anglican Church back to Protestantism and making England itself the leader of Protestantism. So here you have two rulers and two countries both becoming the leaders of their faith, Catholic and Protestant here. Now, what draws these two into more of a conflict is Elizabeth. She is responsible for sending troops to the Spanish Netherlands to support a Protestant revolt there. Now, the Netherlands are right here, right there northeast of France. So looking at this map, you see all the dark shaded areas here are places that Spain either controlled or had a lot of influence through their family, the Habsburgs. One of those is the Netherlands there. So what causes a problem here is this Protestant revolt that pops up in the Netherlands is aided by the English, and eventually the Spanish Netherlands actually break away from Spain and the Catholic Church. Of course, this is going to make Philip II very, very angry. The other thing that Elizabeth does is to kill a Scottish queen, Mary Stuart, who was a Catholic Scottish queen, who was supposedly plotting to kill Elizabeth. And the idea was that if she killed Elizabeth, she would take over the English throne and turn it back to Catholicism. So both of these acts, Elizabeth's aid to the Netherlands combined with the execution of a Catholic queen, was too much for Philip, who saw Elizabeth's Protestant reign as a cancer upon Europe that must be crushed. And his way of responding to this is to build an armada, a fleet of warships to invade England. Now his goal here isn't to conquer England, he simply wants to invade England, take out Elizabeth, and put a Catholic monarch back on the throne. So in 1588, Spain sends the Spanish Armada to do this very job, to take out Elizabeth and replace her with a Catholic monarch. But England's smaller ships, which were more maneuverable, along with a storm that pops up, deals Spain a humiliating defeat. So the ships that are left after this failed invasion attempt to go around England and come back for a counterattack, but they too encounter a storm, and most of those are shipwrecked. They're on the Irish coast, and this signals England's rise as a naval power. Again, looking back, Spain had been Europe's dominant sea power. Well, now that the English have defeated them, they kind of rise to take that place. They become a huge naval power. Actually, they become the most dominant sea power in Europe, and that will stay true until the 20th century. Now, news of the defeat of the Spanish Armada had strengthened Protestant resistance throughout Europe, with Spain never really fully recovering their great imperial power they once had. Spain had had its golden age, and now it was over. With the Spanish now weakened, the new dominant sea power of England would help strengthen Protestant resistance to Catholic oppression in many parts of Europe. So this growing conflict between Catholics and Protestants will spark numerous religious wars throughout Europe that will continue on throughout the 16th and 17th centuries.